All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for the webinar. My name is Vanessa. I'm a qualitative mentor here at Statistics Solutions. We are a full service dissertation consulting company. And what that means is that we are here to provide assistance and support to doctoral students like yourselves through all stages of the dissertation. So we help from topic development all the way through to the end of the dissertation when you are presenting your final defense. We have a team of research, qualitative, and quantitative mentors on staff here to really help out. You'll also see in the chat, we've got Sierra on today. She'll be helping in the background, providing helpful links and also assisting with any technical difficulties. She's currently put some links in the chat if you want to find out more about us, our homepage, and also make use of any of the free resources that we have available to you all on our website. You can also get signed up for other webinars. So I noticed that a few of you are working on different chapters of the dissertation right now. We do have webinars for each of the chapters for all qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods type of studies. As an attendee, you will receive a copy of the webinar within 24 to 48 hours, as well as the slide deck that I'm using today. So if you're coming in late, don't worry about that at all. We've got you covered. And if you want to reference this later, you will be able to do that as well. And then if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to pop them in the chat. I'll leave some time at the end to go through the questions. And then if you have any questions that are about our services, again, we'll put some links in the chat regarding those. And we do provide a complimentary 30-minute consultation. So if after today you feel like you may benefit from some more one-on-one assistance, that might be a helpful tool to you. We pretty much use that consultation as a way to hear what help you need, what your study is about, and where we can best support you in the process. But again, my name is Vanessa, and we are going to get started. So this slide here presents an overview of the webinar today, as well as what should go into your methods chapter. So I'm going to talk about each of these sections in detail. This is a compilation of what students will typically be required to put into their methods section. But I always remind students that if you have a template or a checklist or any resources from your chair or your reviewers on what they would like you to include, it's always best to refer to that template because ultimately they're the ones that are going to be signing off on your dissertation. So you're going to have to go through enough hoops as a doctoral student and a candidate. So you don't want to make extra work for yourself by not following exactly, whatever template or resource they're giving you. But if you don't have anything like that available to you, this is a really good place to start. This list here. So you'll generally start with the introduction. You'll include the research design, role of the researcher, methodology, issues of trustworthiness, and a summary at the end. So again, I'll touch on each of these sections and talk a little bit more specifically about what needs to go in each of these during the webinar today. In your introduction, you want to restate the purpose of your study, and you want to do this verbatim. Yes, Jacqueline, you will receive the slides and a video of the webinar today. So you'll want to restate your purpose of your study verbatim. So you can literally copy and paste the purpose of the study that you've outlined in your introduction chapter into the introduction of your methods chapter and anywhere else where you're restating the purpose. This is not the place where you want to get creative or start changing things. I know it may feel redundant to really be copying and pasting the purpose, but it's important to do this to make sure that you're maintaining a consistent purpose throughout your entire dissertation. So you don't want the reader to get to chapter 3 and read, a reworded purpose and think, okay, what is the study doing, or where did things change? So once you do that, you'll want to preview what's upcoming in the chapter. So you can do that by previewing the major sections that you're going to talk about. So I like to think of this introduction as looking forward and looking back. So you're looking back, reminding them about what your study is about, what the purpose is, kind of reorienting them to the chapter. And then you're looking forward by previewing what you're going to be talking about in this chapter. Then in your research design, you want to restate the research questions very clearly. Again, this should be word for word. So exactly the same as what you've written out your research questions to be in previous chapters. You don't want to change these at all. Don't change the wording, just don't do anything there. And here, when you're restating these research questions, you're reminding the reader of what your study is about and what those research questions are that you're going to address or answer using the design. Then you want to identify whatever the concept is that you're studying. So maybe you're doing a case study and you are going to be defining the case or cases, or maybe you're using a phenomenological study. And so in that case, you'll be defining what the phenomenon is. You want to identify and define that very clearly to the reader. And then you want to talk about your approach. So for the purposes of this presentation, you are most likely going to be doing a qualitative study. So since you're all here, I'll kind of move forward with qualitative. We won't touch on quantitative today during the presentation. So for both the qualitative study and the design specifically, you'll need to demonstrate that you're familiar with both qualitative and quantitative studies, and then also perhaps mixed methods. And then you want to justify why the qualitative approach is the most appropriate for your study. So I like to think of this as using a couple of paragraphs to just high level outline why researchers would use a qualitative study, what they're good for, and then same thing for quantitative, and then same thing for mixed methods. So this is where you're just demonstrating the knowledge. You're kind of setting the stage for how you decided the type of research design that you would use. So you're showing, I know what quantitative is, I know what qualitative is, and I know what mixed methods is. And then all of that kind of sets the foundation for where you're going to be describing why qualitative is the best fit for your study. Now, this choice should be aligned with the problem, the purpose, and the research questions for your study. So it can't just be that, you want to do qualitative, so you've selected qualitative. There should really be alignment across all of those things that's driving your research design selection. So you wouldn't approach a study by saying, I'm going to conduct a case study and then work backwards. You would start off by thinking about what kind of data do you want to collect? What is your research question? And what makes the most sense within the qualitative framework? So really thinking bottom up instead of going backwards. So once you've established why you've selected a qualitative design, then you're going to do the same thing regarding what particular research design you've chosen. So you're going to talk about different types of designs within that qualitative framework. So you may demonstrate your familiarity with case studies, phenomenology. You might talk about what a generic qualitative design is. And then once you've demonstrated that knowledge, you'll explain the design that you've selected. So maybe you've selected a case study, and you will talk about why that's the most appropriate choice for your study. Okay, so kind of going backwards now, why would you decide to use a qualitative design? Oftentimes, the research question in these cases would be along the lines of trying to understand participants' perspectives on something, or their experiences with something, or their lived experiences and how they make meanings of those experiences. So to really get at this, then we would collect data through probably interviews, maybe focus groups, maybe some document analysis, or even observations. So those are the types of data collection methods that would be included in a qualitative study. And that's because they yield textual data, so words. So comparing that to quantitative, when we're looking at quantitative data, it's largely numbers, frequencies. So if you are not looking for information that's really going to be translated or understood through numbers, then it makes sense for you to do a qualitative study. That's a pretty good indicator. Then the goal for the qualitative study, unlike the quantitative, generally isn't to generalize your findings to an entire large population, right? The sample size in a qualitative study is going to be much smaller than that of a quantitative study, and that's because of the nature of the data collection. So if you are doing a study to understand the experience of homeless women in California, for example, you probably aren't going to be able to interview 300 homeless women within the constraints of your doctoral experience, right? You might have a sample size of maybe 7 to 15 or something like that. So because these sample sizes are smaller, there is less generalizability. So that's just another feature of the qualitative design when compared to the quantitative. Also, there isn't any hypothesis testing in the qualitative studies, and we don't quantify the results because it's textual data. So these are just some features that you might consider if you don't want to test a hypothesis, then this might be the type of design that you would tend towards. So there are a number of qualitative designs. This list is not exhaustive. This is just what I commonly see when working with students. But again, there's many, many different types of designs within the qualitative umbrella that you could choose from. So I'll provide a high-level overview of these, but here are just 5 common ones. So case studies are really helpful when you are looking at a specific example of something, perhaps over time. It's really an in-depth analysis of a particular case or multiple cases if you're doing a multiple case study. So the way that I think of this is just taking a really deep dive into something, looking at it from 360 degrees and just really getting a holistic look. Multiple case studies are if you have more than one case and they're bounded by something that's uniting them. So something that gives them a common thread. Case studies in terms of data collection use multiple data collection methods. So you would probably be conducting interviews, but not just interviews. You would probably also pull in something like a document analysis. Maybe you would do some observations of your participants and just kind of make use of multiple data collection methods. That's really the hallmark of case studies. And the reason for that is because, again, you're really drilling down into that case and looking at it from all different angles. So you want to include different types of data to inform what you're learning about. And then the outcome of a case study is generally a really rich description of that case. And you can use something like thematic analysis to analyze your data, which is going to determine the themes or the patterns that emerge from the study or the case or cases if it's a multiple case study. Phenomenology is a little bit different. So this one has philosophical underpinnings. It's also deeply rooted in psychology. And that's because this has to do with the lived experiences and making meaning. So what meanings do participants assign to their different experiences? So if you're exploring how people make sense of their experiences, then this study would make sense for what you're trying to do. So again, a high-level overview here. These studies make use of in-depth interviews. We rarely see other forms of data collection included in these types of studies. And when I say in-depth, that can mean, hours are spent with participants, perhaps multiple interviews, so multiple data collection points as well. And the outcome of these types of studies is a really rich description of whatever the essence of the experience is, so the phenomenon. What you're looking for here is just looking to see what are those common experiences among participants. Again, noting that there will be some participants that don't conform to what all the other participants say, so it's okay to have outliers. But here you're really just trying to see across all participants, how are they making meaning of these experiences and are they doing it in a similar way? So you're really just distilling down to that experience, which in this case is called the essence, to see if there's any common core to it, and then understanding how people are assigning meaning to that. Now, generic qualitative designs are very helpful when your study doesn't fit nicely within maybe the framework of a phenomenological study or an ethnographic study. Sometimes I hear these phrased as descriptive qualitative studies or general qualitative studies. There's research and there's literature that you'll find using the different terminology. So if you're researching different studies, those all kind of mean the same thing. Generic does not mean that it's less good or less rigorous. I think it has kind of a stigma attached to it, even though there's plenty of literature to support the use of this type of study. But sometimes dissertation chairs might turn it down just because it doesn't feel as specialized. So if you are less concerned with how people are making sense of an experience and you're more concerned with the experience itself, so the focus is more outward for your research question and not the psychology or the inward experience, then a generic or generalized approach might be useful for your study. In this type of study, you can use interviews, questionnaires, surveys, documents, observations, whatever data collection technique that you need to address your research question would work for this type of study. And I popped in a citation at the bottom there, Percy et al. 2015. If you are wanting to use this type of study, but you're having trouble rationalizing it or explaining why it makes sense, that can be a helpful paper to read. It provides a really viable and defensible reason for this design. So, if you're in the proposal phase or anything like that, that might be helpful to use. So what's helpful about the generic qualitative design is that it's very flexible. So unlike some other approaches where you have to adhere to a sort of prescribed design, you really don't have to do that here. And that doesn't mean that you can just kind of pick and choose whatever, feels right. You do have to think within the generic qualitative design of what's justifiable in terms of your data collection and your analysis and your sample size. So you definitely still have to keep it within the context of your problem, purpose, and research questions, but you do have some more freedom in terms of those data collection techniques and the data analysis process that you intend to use. Grounded theory. This is one that I don't see a whole lot of. It's really sociological in nature. The social sciences use it. And grounded theory works a little bit differently because you wouldn't be working from a theoretical framework and you wouldn't necessarily be working from research questions. So the idea here is that there's not a whole lot known about a particular topic. And so through data collection and field work, you would refine your ideas around a particular topic. So you would refine your ideas and your research questions. So this is an iterative process and it starts kind of in a different place. So this isn't always the most friendly design for novice researchers. It's also both time consuming and then subsequently it can be financially consuming within the constraint of a doctoral program, because it may take a little longer to get through your data collection, to develop your theory. And so it may not be the most resource friendly type of design for doctoral students who are trying to finish their program and kind of move on. The outcome of a grounded theory study is that you will develop a theory rooted in your data. And so that would look like an explanation of whatever's going on, whatever the concept is, or the process, or the action that you're studying. You would develop a theory on that based on what you're seeing in the data. And so this differs from the other studies that I've talked about because rather than starting with your research questions and letting that guide you, you're collecting the data and then based on what you found, thinking through that data to develop research questions and a theory. So again, it's just a little bit more involved and just starts in a different place. Ethnography, this is another one I don't see a whole lot of. This is really anthropological in nature and also has some roots in sociology. So this type of design makes use of extended time in the field, participant observations. So again, it's a little bit more time consuming and a little bit more resource consuming, but it can be really helpful if you are trying to understand the cultural or societal context of a problem that you're intending to research. So this is a very holistic design in nature. Here you'll be looking at networks of people or institutions or groups of people to understand all of the circumstances surrounding whatever the research problem is. So the outcome from this type of design is an in-depth account of whatever that problem is from the perspective of both the participant, but also the researcher. So you're kind of getting an insider and outsider view placed within this larger cultural context. Again, those are not all of the designs that are available to you, but those are just a few that we'll touch on today. And then once you've talked about your research design, you will want to talk about your role as the researcher. So as the researcher, you'll typically have different roles. If you're conducting a grounded theory or an ethnographic study, your role is probably as a participant observer, where you're both observing people as well as participating in the activities of daily life. But that isn't the case for all studies. So if you are conducting a different study, you may be interviewing participants, in which case you would be kind of an observer. Or you may be in a situation where you have a research assistant or a research team. So here you'll just want to talk about what that looks like for your study and describe exactly what your role is and how you'll be interacting with participants. This section is important because it's where you're going to be showing the impact of you being the researcher. So generally, any type of study, there's a potential for researcher bias. So by describing your role here, you can really lay out what the context is for you participating in your research and highlighting any potential biases that may arise, any blind spots that you may have that could mitigate or influence the results of your study. So what we're aiming for here is just transparency. If you are collecting data at somewhere where you work maybe, or maybe you work in a school district and you're collecting data at a school that's within the district, but not the one that you work at. Something like that, that's important to disclose here and identify any potential power differentials between you and your participants. So for example, if you are interviewing students, really important to note that here because that may impact the responses that you're getting from your participants and by way of that, your results. So any power differentials, and any other issues or conflicts that you think are important to note. And then you want to emphasize how you plan to handle those and reduce any biases or mitigate any of those potential conflicts. In the methodology section, you will probably have a couple of different subheadings underneath this. So you'll want to talk about your participants, your instrumentation, your procedures, all of the written procedures and the recruitment procedures that you intend to use, and then any data analysis. So we'll start off with the participants. Here you'll want to talk about the overall population from which your sample is drawn. So just a reminder, the population is the large group that you want to make inferences about, and then the sample is the group that participates in your study. So if you are conducting a study where you want to learn more about pregnant women during the pandemic, maybe. The large population would be pregnant women, but since you're not going to be able to include every pregnant person in your study, the sample is going to be whichever ones you have access to. So that might mean pregnant women at your local OBGYN or your local hospital, maybe 10 to 15 women that you're able to include in the study. So in this section here, you want to describe that overall target population, so pregnant women, and then you want to talk about how you intend to sample that group. So in qualitative studies, you are probably not going to be using random sampling. You'll probably use some kind of purposeful sample because there is a good chance that whatever it is that you're studying, you need people who fit into a certain criteria. So again, with that example of pregnant women, it wouldn't make sense to use a random sample because you might not include people who are pregnant. So in this case, you would have that pre-established criteria. They would have to be pregnant during the months of whenever the pandemic started to now. So again, just kind of setting up that foundational criteria for why these people are being included in your study. Other things that could include, it could be age limits. So maybe you only want participants who are over the age of 50 or, whatever it may be for your study. It could also be working at a particular organization. So if you are doing some type of study that is related to a particular school or a particular profession, it may be that they need to have worked at a certain place for a certain amount of time. So really just thinking through that inclusion criteria. If you're doing a study related to caregivers, it could be that your purposeful sample will include people who have had the experience of caring for a sick loved one or something like that. So again, just thinking through who do you want to sample and how can you include that in a way that's meaningful to make sure that you're getting at those participants. So whatever those characteristics are that you need, that should be included here. And then you want to talk about how you intend to verify those characteristics. So will you be phone screening? Will you be maybe calling people and having some set questions to ensure that they meet those characteristics? Will you use a survey, maybe an electronic survey like a Google form or a SurveyMonkey, where you have some basic screening questions that are going to let you or help you exclude or include people in your study? So you'll want to outline that process here. And then you'll want to talk about the number of participants. So how many participants do you need to recruit for your study? And then what steps will you take to identify, contact, and recruit those participants? As far as your sample size goes, you can look in the literature to see what sample size is appropriate for the type of design that you're doing. It does vary by design, but there's a lot of resources and different papers that give different estimates. So you'll want to provide a little bit of rationale here for the sample size that you've selected. And then when you get to the part where you're discussing identifying, contacting, and recruiting participants, you want to be as detailed as possible. So almost as if you're speaking to an alien, exactly the steps that you're going to go through so that if somebody else wants to replicate your study, they can do exactly what you did. So really, really take the reader by the hand, let them know where you're recruiting. Are you recruiting online, in person, by phone? Are you standing on, the corner? How are you doing it? Once participants become aware of your study, so maybe you distributed flyers at a particular organization. Once they become aware, how are they getting in contact with you? Okay, they see your flyer, they have your email, they email you to let you know that they're interested. Once that contact has been made, how do you recruit them? So do you deploy your screening survey? Do you call them and do an initial screener to ensure that they meet your inclusion criteria? At that point, do you have the participant fill out their informed consent or give their verbal consent? So really just outlining each of those little steps that's happening during that process from when you identify all the way through to recruit your participants. Oh, and then you'll also want to talk about how your sample relates to data saturation. So again, going into the literature, there are resources to let you know like how many participants you might need in order to reach data saturation. And then for those who don't know, that just means the point where you're not learning anything new from participants. So after interviewing 15 participants, it may be that no new themes begin to emerge. So you'll just want to talk about where you think data saturation will be. And then if you don't reach it, like let's say you interview 15 people and on number 15, there's completely new ideas happening. Will you then go out and recruit more participants? What does that process look like? How do you intend to handle that? So you'll want to talk about that here. And then the next section is going to be your instrumentation. So here you'll want to include information about all of your data collection instruments. So if you are conducting a phenomenological study with interviews, then you will have an interview protocol and you want to describe that interview protocol. But if you have multiple data collection techniques, then you'll want to talk about each one. So I would section this out, or I would organize this section by the instrument. So for those then that you want to identify So if you want to talk about each of the different data collection instruments that you're using, maybe you're going to start off with an interview, and then you'll go into a document review and then participant observations. You just want to have a subheading for each of those, and talk about how you developed that data collection method and then what it's going to look like for you. If you are doing any type of document review or document analysis, you want to identify what sources you're reviewing. So let's say you're doing a study of college professors and you're going to be reviewing their course curriculums. You want to outline what that source is, what it's intended for, and how you're accessing it. So maybe it's a publicly available source. You want to let the reader know of that. And then you want to talk about how you're verifying that it is an accurate source. So how do you know that this is the true document that pertains to whatever you're studying? And then you'll also want to talk about how these data sources relate to your study and how they're going to accurately answer your research questions. So if you are conducting an interview or a focus group, for example, and you have a protocol with prescribed questions that you plan on asking each participant, it could be helpful to set up a table to show the reader how the questions align to your particular research questions. So if your study is asking what are the barriers and facilitators to teachers that want to pursue professional development opportunities, you might have, that might be your research question, and then you might have 15 interview questions. So you just want to show which interview questions that you intend to ask are going to answer that particular research question. And this is also very helpful just when you start to pull together your interview protocol, because it makes sure that you're staying on task and that you're going to get data that's going to answer your research questions later on. Again, so one way you might do that is by using a table. Then in the procedures section, this is where you want to come back to really just listing out exactly what you're going to do, like a recipe book. So one way that you might start this section is to write out a bulleted list of each of these things I have on screen. So for every instrument that you intend to use, again, if you are doing a case study, you'll have multiple data collection instruments, but there are other studies where you might just have one. So whatever that looks like for you, you want to outline where you intend to collect the data. So again, is it going to be online, in person? Is it going to be at a particular organization? How do you plan to do that? Who's going to collect it? So are you doing the interviews? Do you have a research assistant doing them? Whatever it looks like for you. How often do you intend to collect the data? So if you are doing a study that requires, really long interviews, maybe you intend to break them up and do, 2 or 3 data collection events. Whatever that looks like, you'll talk about it here. You can also provide an estimate for how long you believe the events will take place. So if you do have an interview protocol, it may be a good idea to pilot it and just kind of practice it with not real participants, but practice it maybe with your reviewers or one participant to see how long it might be. And that's also important for when you are informing participants about the study. You want to be able to give them an estimate for how long it'll take. And then this is a really important point that I feel like people miss sometimes. So how do you intend to record the data? It kind of gets overlooked. So are you going to have your phone recording it? Will you have the participants log on to Zoom and record it that way? Whatever your plan is, you want to make sure to note that here, and also note how you intend to prepare that data for analysis. So if you are maybe recording on Zoom, Zoom has a transcript option. So you'll talk about that. Maybe I'm going to use Zoom transcription, or I'm going to send recordings to a transcription company and have my data transcribed professionally. Whatever the process is, you'll want to talk about that. And then any debriefing procedures that you might do. So one example of that could be maybe member checking. So sometimes people will have their data transcribed, and then they'll share the transcription with the participant just to confirm that it's accurately conveying the experience that they shared. So if you have any type of procedures where you are reaching back out to participants, you'll want to outline those here as well. Another example could be the transcript verification. So it's kind of the same thing, just making sure that the participant believes that your transcript is accurately presenting what they've said. So you'll want to talk about that. And then you'll want to talk about the data analysis plan. So here, again, if you've got multiple data collection methods, you'll want to talk about how you plan to analyze each of them. And you'll want to talk about the different systems that you're going to use to analyze them. So you can apply a particular data analysis procedure like thematic analysis. I see that as a very common thing that students will use. It's a 6-step process of analyzing data. And it can be used for interviews, observational data, and documents. But there's others out there. That's just one example. But here you're going to want to talk about how you intend to code your data, and then any type of software that you use for the analysis. So when it comes to analyzing qualitative data, it can be helpful to rely on some type of qualitative data analysis software. That could be like NVivo, MaxQDA, Deduce, something like that. What they do is basically you can code different excerpts, so different things that participants have said, and then you can look back at those particular codes to see all of the excerpts that fall under that code. So it can be helpful just to organize, especially if you've got a lot of pages of transcripts, or really, I guess that's where it's the most helpful. It's just very helpful in organizing the codes and seeing exactly what participants said and seeing how they compare to other participants. But if you don't have that available to you, other ways that you can analyze data are, of course, you can do it by hand. So you can, use highlighting and papers and pen to kind of do the same thing. So highlighting those different areas where participants talked about things within the same context or shared similar sentiments. You can do that way. Or you can use Excel. So create kind of somewhat of pivot tables where you're writing your codes across the columns and then including your participant excerpts down across each row and kind of coding that way. So there's a few options, and we have a blog post on our website about this. So if you have questions, do check that out. So once you've described how you intend to code the data and what software you used, you'll want to talk about or think about any way that you intend to handle discrepant cases. So again, when it comes to qualitative data, it's not uncommon that you may have 1 or 2 participants that just don't go along with the other participant responses. You might have 10 participants say that they have professional development available to them and they love the supports within their school system. And then you've got 2 that say the exact opposite. Important here is that you don't want to throw those participants out. You want to keep that data because it's showing the reader that the experience or the phenomenon that you're studying is not consistent or is not the same across every participant. So here you'll just want to talk about how you're going to handle those discrepant cases and how you're going to kind of discuss them in your results. And then once you do that, you will want to talk about the trustworthiness. So there's a lot of literature about trustworthiness in qualitative studies. The 4 tenets that you'll typically talk about are credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. So you want to talk about how you intend to maintain each of these things within your study. So how do you intend to ensure that the results of your study can be read with confidence and that they are accurate or applicable to other context groups or participants? And then also, are your findings consistent with previous findings, or are they something that another researcher can replicate to conduct a similar study? There are different ways to establish trustworthiness. You could use something like member checking, which I mentioned earlier, where you're having participants verify transcripts. You can also use triangulation, so using multiple data sources and then comparing those multiple data sources. One thing to note with triangulation is that although It's called triangulation. You don't need 3 data sources. You can just have 2 data sources in order to triangulate data. And then another example could be using an audit trail. So throughout the process of your data collection and analysis, you could journal the steps that you're taking. And that would be one other way to establish trustworthiness. So here for this section, you really just have to decide how you intend to establish these things. And the way that you'll organize it is by having a subheading for each of these tenets here, and then just talking about how you intend to establish that particular tenet within your study. And then the almost last bit of your section here is going to be the ethical procedures section. So this is going to be a very helpful section when you're moving into your IRB phase. So the more information that you can pack into here, the less work you'll make for yourself when you are applying for your IRB. So here you'll want to include how you are going to gain access to your participants or any research sites. So if you are collecting data at an elementary school, for example, you may need to get permission from the school administrators to do that. So you'll want to talk about that here. If you are accessing any data, so if you are doing a document review, you'll want to talk about how you're gaining access to documents. So that would be important to include here, and also for your school's IRB when you do apply for the IRB. And then you'll want to really just talk about the treatment of human participants or human subjects. So kind of outlining those Belmont report basic ethical considerations and how you intend to uphold those things in your study. So how are you going to ensure that your recruitment procedures are ethical or your data collection is ethical? And then it's also really important here to also talk about the treatment of your data. So how do you intend to ensure that participants are being kept anonymous and that their data is being kept confidential? So some ways that you might do that in a qualitative study are not using identifying information in your transcripts. So maybe after you have recorded your sessions and you get your transcripts made, you go through and you audit your transcripts and take out names, phone numbers, addresses, emails, anything that would make the participant identifiable. You'll also want to think about how you intend to secure your data. So is it being kept in a file cabinet, maybe, if you printed out your transcripts or something, or if you have notes, maybe you took observational notes on the participant. So is that kept under lock and key? How are you doing that? And then if it's online, how is it being secured online? So are you using password protected files? Whatever that process looks like for you, you'll want to talk about that. And then who has access to the data? If you do have a research team, does everybody have access to it? Are there, different levels of access depending on what type of member of the team they are? You'll want to think about that. And then once your study is concluded, what do you intend to do with this data? So typically you will destroy the data after a certain period of time. So you'll just want to outline that here as well. And then finally, the last section is going to be your summary. So I know by this point you've written quite a bit, but here in the summary, you just want to really highlight those main points so that if somebody has no time to read your whole chapter, they're still walking away understanding exactly what you're doing to conduct your study. And that's to ensure that when they move into the results chapter, they have that context for, okay, what was the population that was sampled here? How is data collected? What type of data was collected? And then how is it ultimately analyzed? So here, really just kind of try to dig deep to get those main points out. And then again, you're looking back, but also looking forward. So you're reminding the reader of everything that you've written, and then you're going to provide a transition into the next chapter, letting them know that the results of the study will be presented in the following chapter. And then just a few tips for writing this chapter. I know it can be very daunting because this is the time where you're kind of setting the process for your study, right? You're really starting to think about what exactly am I am I going to do? So you're not going to be summarizing or synthesizing literature at this point. You're really getting into that planning and design phase. So I think somewhere where students get caught up is kind of trying to trend towards the perfect and really just planning it out. And thinking of like the what ifs. So maybe what if I'm not able to recruit 12 participants, or what if I can't conduct my interviews in person because there's the COVID protocols or something like that. So I think the best thing that you can do when you're writing this section to kind of break out of those what ifs is to have contingency plans in place. So thinking about, okay, if I cannot collect data at a particular site, or if I can't collect data from 15 participants, what am I going to do to make that up? So really thinking of that backup plan. And then the second thing that's really important is to just understand that there are going to be things that go wrong in data collection or data analysis, and that's okay. That's why we have limitation sections, and that's why in the results section, you'll have the opportunity to report back on what procedures you actually did during your study. So I think just remember here in this section, it's a planning phase and things aren't always going to go to plan, but later on throughout your dissertation, you'll be able to talk about where you deviated from your plan, what the implications of that were, and then ways that you mitigated any stumbling blocks that you may have bumped into. And even down to your methodology. So it may be that you start writing this and you start to collect data and you have to switch methodologies later on, and that's okay. There's place in your dissertation to discuss those things later on. So really just kind of breaking out of that what if mindset and kind of setting your plan with the not expectation, but the flexibility that it might change later on. But that does conclude the presentation today. I do see that we have a lot of questions in the chat, so I will get to those. But again, we do provide full dissertation services. So if you feel like you could benefit from more one-on-one, please feel free to check out the resources in the chat or to reach out to us for that complimentary consultation. And let's get to these questions.